Missions texts. There's a ton of them in Scripture. Matthew 28 comes to mind right away, the Great Commission. Matthew 24, this gospel shall be preached and then the end shall come. Mark 16, preach the gospel to all the nations. I think probably the greatest missions text, though, was the one Jesus spoke to Nicodemus. One of your very favorite Bible texts as a kid. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life, to quote from King James. But for God so loved the cosmos, for God so loved the world, the nature of God's love being focused on humanity, on this planet. When we look at the planet now and take into consideration the state that it's in and what some of the basic information about the planet is, we have to acknowledge the fact that things are changing so rapidly. The rate of change that's taking place is something not previously seen in all of history. Not long ago, someone showed me an interesting way of looking at that by just simple mathematic equations of using a plus sign to talk about the addition of knowledge, the growth of information, the relationship of our minds to new things. And the plus sign was simply the idea, of course, of adding new things on and doing that incrementally as we live our lives. And as I thought about the illustration that was given and the different mathematic signs, it occurred to me from my own life, simple illustration of that and change that takes place in the rate of change and what that looks like. For me, the plus sign probably was the day my dad came home with a stereo and a black and white television, which was a big deal in our house. I know that sounds like ancient history, and probably is, but he came home with a stereo and a TV all in one day. It was like more than I could stand, and the next week he came home with an air conditioner. You know, they must have given him a raise where he was teaching, but an air conditioner in Missouri, because we grew up in California, was a big deal because the climate was quite challenging for us. And I still remember watching as the air conditioner kicked on and I watched our little TV and the screen get significantly smaller as black filled in around the picture, but it still was an addition. It was an addition of change. It was an addition of the advancements of technology into our lives. And those kinds of things came along occasionally, as they did for my parents. Later, though, quite a bit later, as change begins to accelerate, the multiplication sign seems to be more appropriate. And the simple illustration I have of that is the day that I got my brain around email and thinking about what that looked like and how that even worked. It took a while. It took a while to determine how I could go to the post office in the sky and pull a letter out of one side while the guy is on the other end in Russia or Thailand or in Carthage, Missouri, was pulling out the information I was sending him. But it was like my world got significantly larger, and it was a multiplication effect that happened with me. But I think you see where this is going. The multiplication of information is no longer on a simple arithmetic scale or even a multiplying scale, but it is at an exponential scale in terms of how information is being regarded and what is being gathered and the amount of information that we're dealing with, and the rate. All of that means is the rate of change that is taking place on the planet. The planet is changing. Humanity is changing at a pace unknown in history, and we don't even know the effects of the rate of change upon in terms of anthropology, the effects of the rate of change on humanity itself, what the outcomes of that will be and what that spells. It is incredibly important, if we have the heart of God and we have a missional purpose to see redemption come to every aspect and every corner of this globe, that we are paying attention to what is happening and what is a true picture of the world. You might think of these same signs, if you will, in basic terms of historic eras, the classical era, the modern era, the way in which change took place in all of these, and of course, following that, the postmodern era. But I might even be tempted to move away from the typical historic ways in which we look at that in terms of the rate of change and assign it a little bit different. I think of it in terms of localized, urbanized, and globalized. And where we find ourselves now is most definitely in the latter category, dealing with rates of change previously unknown. Now, globalization is not a new idea by any means, or a new observation about things that are happening in humanity. Globalization is defined by social scientists as a shrinking of distance, a bringing about of a nearness and a nearing of other components of society or of distance, the distances of travel, the distances of communication, the distances of linguistic challenge, all those types of things. Globalization is a shrinking of our world. And this has happened in various times in history. It happened during the Roman Empire, which facilitated the spread of the gospel. It happened during the explorer era of the 16th, 15th centuries as explorers went out and the world got smaller and showed up in their newspapers, so to speak, as they were reading about the exploits of Captain Cook and many others, and the awareness of the rest of the globe and what was taking place. It is definitely taking place today with the advent of technology and the significance that brings to our world, and how the lines of distance are almost non-existent in some ways. Globalization taking place with perhaps an exponential factor involved. The planet as we look at it, the planet and the condition of the planet and where it is and where we are in terms of humanity. When we say God so loved the world, and we're clear on that being God-loving people, we want to pay attention to how many that represents. You may know this, and if you don't, you can Google it quite easily. Today's population is just a fraction under 7.4 billion people on the planet. 7.4 billion, for many of us, and myself included, I must confess, putting my mind around 1 billion, 1 billion, 2 billion. I remember when we hit 4 billion, it wasn't that long ago. Now we're up over 7, and we're probably on our way to 8 in the next 5 years or so. They do say that the entire curve of the growth of humanity is slowing somewhat, but still, so in a few years more it'll be 10 billion. What's that look like? What are we talking about? 1 billion, 1 million, a zillion, Not long ago somebody shared a thought process with me concerning how to conceptualize, perhaps, even though it's still a stretch, 1 billion. What is 1 billion? 1 billion, of course, as you know, is 1,000 millions. You take 1 million and you multiply it by 1,000, and you get 1 billion. And the way they did this was with a simple exercise, quite a bit of wishing involved perhaps, but let's say you have a rich uncle that dies, passes away, and leaves you in the will, and leaves you $1 million. And he leaves you $1 million with the proviso that you will spend the $1 million inheritance at the rate of $1,000 a day. In other words, you'll receive it $1,000 at a time. You have to spend $1,000 the next day, you get another, and so forth, until you've spent your entire inheritance of $1 million. Quite an enjoyable thought to think about taking advantage of that. I think they've made a movie or two about that very subject, but the idea being that 1 million turns into 1,000 thousands, and I think most of us can get our mind around $1,000. Could you spend $1,000 today if necessary? Yeah, I probably did yesterday on my transmission, but 1,000 thousands is something I can wrap my mind around. And that's 1 million. How long would it take me to gain my inheritance if it were spent at the rate of $1,000 a day? $1 million would take about, 1,000 days? Yeah, that's what it would be. 1,000 days, which would be a little under 3 years. 3 years time, $1,000,000. Okay, million. $1 billion. Let's say someone extremely wealthy left you an inheritance, but they left it with the same proviso. You only got your $1 billion. You get $1 billion. You only got your $1 billion, though, if you spend it at the rate of $1,000 a day. How long would it take for you to spend your inheritance? How long would it take you to spend $1 billion? Well, you just do the same math and you apply it instead of, 1,000 days, a little under 3 years, multiply that by 1,000 and you have 3,000 years. A little under 3,000 years to spend $1 billion at $1,000 a day. Man, that just begins to give me a little bit of an inkling of what we mean when we're talking about humanity as 7.4 billion people. Incredible numbers, every one of them a human being, every one of them a person for whom Christ died, every one of them with a story, every one of them with a particular cultural facet to their lives that is different from many other cultures of the world. Every one of them a person. So let's take the 7.4 billion and let's put it over into faith journeys and think for just a minute about how humanity breaks down in terms of human beings and the different faith journeys that they're on. I think most of you know that Islam is a rather large world religion. Current numbers put it right around 1.6 billion. 1.6 billion Muslims. Now, a simple way to think about that is, and I like to use my hands for illustration, big hands. Use my hands for illustration. If this is humanity, if this is everybody on the planet, 7.4 billion people, this is a Muslim, 1 person in 5. And if I can make it a little more missiological, if this is humanity, all 10 fingers, so shall we say, this is a Muslim woman, Muslim female, 1 person in 10 on the planet, whom I will not have much access to in terms of sharing Christ, but you, my sisters, will. 1.6 billion Muslims, big chunk of humanity. Let's look at another large piece of what humanity looks like. Right around 1 billion Hindus. 1 billion Hindus, most of whom live in India. And India is right around 1.2 billion people by itself as a country. About 1 billion of them, not every Hindu of course lives in India, but most of them do. 1 billion Hindus. Another huge chunk of humanity, right around 1.5 billion. 1.5 billion non-religious, or we can say unreligious. People who, if they were filling out a census and the question of religion came up and they were asked that, how would they state, their religious persuasion, they would put it, I'm an agnostic, or I'm an atheist, or I don't have a religion. And many of those, coincidentally, are found in the nation of China. Many unreligious in the nation of China. 1.6 billion Muslims, 1 billion Hindus, 1 billion Hindus, 1.5 billion non-religious. These are major categories of humanity. And if you took everyone else, of course I'm leaving out a major category as well, but if you took everyone else and we'll just call it other, which includes 500 million Hindus, but you include everyone else in projecting what humanity looks like, you've got about, let's add it up, right around 5 billion just slightly over 5 billion human beings. But you said 7.4 billion, right? 7.4 billion minus 5.1 billion means there's about 2.3 billion Christians in the world. Or people who, if they're filling out a survey and you ask them their faith, they have a religion, they would put Christian. You go, man, 2.3 billion? That's like a third of humanity. Yeah, it is. And it's been right around that percentage for well over a century. About a third of humanity answering the question, what is your religious persuasion? They would answer Christian. Many of them would say, I was born in a particular context and my parents took me to the church and had the priest baptize me, or had in the Orthodox Church I was recognized as being a part of the church. But as far as any relationship with Jesus Christ is concerned, yes, I understand that being a Christian means someone who believes in Jesus, but in the practical aspect of that and what that looks like in life and what that looks like as a Christ follower, not so much. A simple way to look at the world is to divide it into thirds. And you put it like this, and you have Christians, and you can lump, if it's probably a terrible thing to do, but just for purposes of statistics, you lump Hindus with Muslims, and you've got about a third, and everyone else, we'll just say other, including non-religious, including Buddhists, including Zoroastrians, including the Jewish faith. This is the planet. This is what it looks like. Now the temptation would be, oh, there's a third of us are Christians. Well, in order for everyone to know about Christ, and in order for everyone to have an opportunity to meet Jesus, I just need to talk to 2 people, in my whole life. That's all I need to do. And there's an element of truth to that, and there is, largely speaking, that hasn't been done. But the fact of the matter is that the percentages have shifted little over the last century or more. And it does have something to do with how you break down the Christian population. Because right around 1/2 of the Christian population worldwide could easily be termed as nominal, meaning in name, and right around 1/2 are Christ followers, or those who say, Jesus is my Lord, the Bible is my book, and I follow Him. So you've got slightly over 1 billion serious Christians, evangelical Christians. I don't know how you want to say that. Some would say, well, I'm not comfortable in making those kinds of characterizations. Fine, but that's what missiological experts do, and they look at the way in which the planet is functioning and the way in which faith is being expressed, and those are the kind of statistics they come up with. However you look at the Christian population in relationship to the total population, it wouldn't be hard to gather the conclusion come to the conclusion that why isn't more happening? Why aren't the purposes of God being accomplished in a more obvious way? And I'm going to share a little bit later some of the incredible things that have been happening around the world in various parts of the world. But the overall picture is one that requires a lot of thought and consideration, and one that we need to be serious about. When we think about the distinct people groups of the world, the ethne, as we talked about earlier, for God so loved the world, the peoples of the world. The word in the New Testament for nations is the word ethne. When you find that word, you find the word Gentile, it's the same word. The word Gentile is the word ethne. The nations, the people groups, the fragments of humanity the components, the chambers of the waffle, if you will. And when you look at how many ethne there are on the planet, how many chambers to the waffle, the number is right around 6,000. When you ask the question how many different people groups there are that have not heard the gospel, where there's not a viable presence of the church, where there's not, if you will, someone who's come into the chamber and had the gospel make sense to them in their particular cultural setting. The number of unreached people groups on the planet today numbers close to 6,000. 6,000 different facets of humanity where the church has not been planted in an effective way. 6,000 chambers of the waffle that have not yet received the love of God in such a way that there's a sustainable community among them. There is much to do when we talk about Missio Dei. In understanding His world and understanding the nature of His world helps us see things as He sees them. Because that's what I want. That's what I want more than anything else. And this is a scary statement, if I can say so. It's a scary statement to say, God, let me see the world as you see it. Let my heart beat for the things that your heart beats for. Let my heart be broken for the things that break your heart. Let my heart find joy for the things that bring your heart joy. This is why I live. This is who I am. This is what it means to follow your Son. Father God, help us to see the world the way you see it. Can you pray that prayer? It's an interesting journey when you really start seeing what He sees, feeling what He feels, hearing what He hears, loving what He loves. It's our journey.